Well, welcome to our series on the Apocalypse. This is going to be episode number 23, chapter 20, the New Jerusalem and Abraham, the Immigrant. We are in our third segment, looking at the Apocalypse of John, having had the first two sections dealing with the historical realities inside the document. And now we are looking at the mystagogic, spiritual, mystical side of the document. We are dealing with that passage that I saw a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. Last week we dealt with the topic of the city of man, and we will begin building on and transitioning from that theme as we begin now moving with Abraham being an immigrant, leaving in order to come to the New Jerusalem. Cities with their man-made mountains and their empires originated in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. The city of Ur, in the eastern end of Mesopotamia, a region that was later called Chaldea, built its own Tower of Babel in about 2100 BC. The ruins of which still stand. The ruins of the Tower of Babel in Ur are still there. In fact, we have a picture there in your manual, the ruins of that tower, and then we have an aerial view of those ruins where in recent years, in the last century, renovations began on restoring this Tower of Babel. And then thirdly, we have a picture of it, the renovations begun on the ground level. And then finally, we have there a picture of American U.S. soldiers on the steps of the renovation of the Tower of Babel there in the city of Ur. The soldiers were there in 2010. And it was from this city, the city of Ur, in 1800 BC, that Abraham began his journey through the Fertile Crescent on his way to leave. You have there a picture of the Fertile Crescent. And what we have, of course, is if this would be Mesopotamia and you had Ur here, the Fertile Crescent that's not going to show up on anything it looks like. I should have turned it like this. And if this is the Mediterranean and this is Egypt, this is the region known as the Fertile Crescent. The city of Ur is here. Haran is here. This will be the promised land here. And so we are looking at the beginning of the journey here in the city of Ur. Abraham will have left Ur on the eastern end of the Fertile Crescent. He will traverse the length of the Fertile Crescent from the cities at the eastern end to the cities of Egypt, and then returning to the promised land of Palestine. It was first an immigration, spelled with an E, which means a leaving from somewhere. In fact, originally there was only the word immigration with an E. It was not until the 19th century, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States, that a new term was invented, immigration with an I and an extra M, for those people who were not just leaving somewhere, but were coming somewhere. So many people were coming to the United States because of the economic opportunity. So an immigration with an E was a leaving from somewhere. It might be war, famine, a loss of water, or other reasons. Perhaps it could be financial ruin or escaping judicial punishment that have forced people to abandon where they live. They depart because circumstances have forced them to depart. Secondly, Abraham's journey will become an immigration with an I, a going towards something, a going somewhere. For example, like going to California during the gold rush, or coming for free land in the Oklahoma land run, or coming for a better job or whatever. The attraction, whatever it was, wherever it was, drew people to a place of opportunity and the promise of a better life. Let me just remind us as a word here in the beginning, theological insights and mystagogic understandings abound in the Scripture. They abound to those knowing that the printed words of Scripture are like garments clothing our body. The words are not the body, only garments on the body. If we are not careful, we mistake the garments for the person and believe we have the person when we only have his or her garments. In first century Judaism, there was a scholar and theologian, Philo of Alexandria in Egypt. Philo knew the Israelite scriptures, knew they contained not only the garments of Israelite history, but also contained the living presence of the God of Israel still speaking through those words and through that story. Inside first century Judaism, Philo belonged to Hellenistic Judaism. We've spoken of this before. He believed the faith of Israel included non-Jews, even as the God of Israel was the universal creator of all mankind. He embraced the use of the Greek language. We're speaking of Philo, that was in use across the eastern end of the Roman Empire as a means of teaching the Jewish diaspora, those that were scattered across the empire, their own Hebrew Israelite faith in a language they could read and understand, since most outside of Palestine no longer could read ancient Hebrew. Philo also embraced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Israelite scriptures, and he wrote in Greek to engage in conversation with a non-Jewish, Greek-speaking culture. Philo believed the ancient Israelite scriptures not only contain spiritual revelation, but also philosophical truth. Philo thus engaged in a conversation with his larger world, with the philosophical, intellectual world on its own terms. He was interested in taking the Hebrew scriptures and the truth that is embodied there, and to make it in the language of the rest of the empire, and to share that truth with a pagan world, that they might come to know the truth themselves. Philo, born maybe in 20 BC and dying perhaps in 50 AD, therefore lived at the time of Jesus, though there is no evidence to suggest he knew of Jesus or ever had any contact with Christian Jews. However, contrary to Western liberal Christianity today, and liberal beliefs coming out at least of the 19th century, that somehow the Gentiles inside Christianity had corrupted the simple faith of a Jewish carpenter's teachings. We have already discussed how our contemporary Jewish scholars have shown that the key beliefs of Christianity, such as the belief in the Trinity and a divine Messiah, existed inside first century Judaism itself, as did the idea of a Gentile mission and the inclusion of Gentiles inside the Jewish eschaton, as opposed to being themes that came into existence after the Gentiles began to come in to Christianity. The issue inside first century Judaism regarding Jesus and Christianity was not a disagreement with its beliefs. The issue was whether Jesus was actually the divine Messiah that was expected inside those beliefs. In other words, the issue was not the beliefs of the Jesus movement, that there was the Trinity, that the Gentiles were to be included. It was not the beliefs, but whether or not Jesus himself was the Messiah expected inside those beliefs inside Judaism. Philo of Alexandria was a first century Jewish theologian and philosopher. Again, there is no evidence he ever had any contact with any Christians, Jews, or Gentile. Christians, whether Jewish or Gentile. However, Philo's comments on Israelite scriptures give us an important understanding of Israelite insight into their own scriptures at the time the church was born. An insight in those scriptures shared by first century Jews and Christian Jews. For example, Philo's writings make use of the term logos that the Apostle John also used in his gospel. The rabbis, after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, abandoned Philo, his writings, as well as the Septuagint itself, in their rejection of the Gentile inclusion in the Jewish eschaton, as they then retreated into a Hebrew rabbinic Judaism. Philo's writings were abandoned by the rabbis, and they have survived because of their value to Jewish Christians. We shall therefore find Philo's comments on Abraham very helpful to us. We will make use of Philo in the several chapters coming, especially after a little groundwork today. Genesis 11:31 begins the migration, the immigration with an E, the leaving of Abraham. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. This would have been the land where the Canaanites lived here, that they were to go to there, and they came to Haran and stopped there and lived there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and he died in Haran. So we have the journey by Abraham with his family, a leaving from Ur, and a leaving to make it to Haran. And so this first leg is where we are going to consider leaving, the necessity of a leaving in order to then a going towards the goal to which one is going. Abraham is introduced in this 11th chapter of Genesis in the genealogies of the descendants of Noah. We are told that Abraham, along with his family, left Ur in the eastern end, the Chaldean end of Mesopotamia, and traveled west to Haran, and at the curve at the top of the Fertile Crescent, Haran was located at what is today the southern border of Turkey against Syria. Turkey extends out into the Mediterranean, so it would be almost to the Mediterranean, but on that border that goes there, due east of the Mediterranean. Adam, of course, in the Old Testament, represents the first man, the founding father of the human race. Noah would be the father of the renewal of humanity. And both Adam and Noah are biological fathers. The third father is Abraham, the father of faith, the father of those who believe. The story of Abraham begins with leaving. There is no hesitancy on his part in leaving. He does not second guess himself. He does not turn back with longing, as his nephew Lot's wife will do later in the story, but he eagerly departs with his family. He hastened eagerly to obey, not as though he were leaving home for a strange land, but rather as a returning from amid strangers to his home. Philo would say. He didn't leave sadly. It was more like he was living in a foreign land and was headed home to a home he had never been. He did not depart like the prodigal to a home that he knew. Abraham left a city, Ur. He left a world where he knew he did not belong, for a home he had never seen. He left because he did not belong where he was. God's world includes the physical. Paradise was mystagogic. It contained both the physical world and the non-physical in the same location. From the beginning, man worked desperately after the fall. Once man rejected the presence, the mystical presence in his physical world, man worked desperately to create his own ordered, singular, that world, independent of everything God desired, created his own version of orderliness. Adam's children and Noah's children and their children's children took this same physical world and created their own version of it, their own cosmos, a world without God. Man built his city from which God was absent. We've dealt with this last week. The city was always a secular city, a godless city, even when it was filled with temples or with a cathedral at its center. You see, the city is an invisible idea, an invisible vision of a world without God that becomes the visible world in which we live, the earthly city. The city is mankind's alternative to a world with God. The city is mankind's world without God. No, thank you. We'd rather do it ourselves. The godlessness is invisibly present in God's absence. It is the absence of God that defines the identity, the identification of the city as city and not paradise. It is not the visible deeds of immoral godlessness that makes the city godless. It is the absence of God that makes the city godless, and which then permits or welcomes the immoral acts of godlessness. We must learn to see the invisible, which is invisibly present. God never left, but when we ate of the fruit, our eyesight lost the ability to see and to be aware of the presence. Let me mention again, as I have in other seminars, the 9-dot problem. Metaphors are helpful to illustrate the invisible. The 9-dot problem asks us to connect 9 dots arranged in 3 rows, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. To connect them with 4 straight lines without taking our pen or our pencil or magic marker off of the page. You have there in your manual a picture of the 9 dots. I first encountered this puzzle while a chaplain at a reformatory for teenage girls operated by the state of Oklahoma many years ago. Psychologist Don Dyer introduced me to, at that time, a recent publication, Change, Principles of Problem Formation and Problem Resolution. The book is still in print. That explored the nature and the concept of change and the difference between a superficial change, such as changing the color of one's hair, which is a change within a system. We might think of moving the furniture in a room. It's a superficial change inside a room. You still have the same room, you still have the same pieces of furniture, they're just arranged in a different order. And it's a little harder to illustrate a change where you exchange systems. It's almost the difference between being in a dream and waking up and not being in the dream. If you're in a dream, you're in one kind of world, but if you're not in that dream, you're in this kind of world. So that first kind of change is a change within the system itself. The second kind of change is an exchange of systems within which that other first level change can take place. And the 9-dot puzzle illustrates both kinds of change for us. And I've given you in your manual 3 possibilities, and you could just try to connect your dots real quick with 4 straight lines. Having paused just for a second to maybe get you a chance to do so, or at least with your mind and a finger to connect. Almost everybody who first tries to solve this problem introduces as part of his problem solving an assumption, an unexamined assumption, which makes the solution impossible. The assumption is that the dots compose a square. It becomes a self-imposed condition which the instructions do not contain. Nothing is said in the directions, connect the dots in 4 straight lines, staying inside a box without taking your pencil from the page. That's not the directions. The failure to solve the puzzle, therefore, does not lie in the impossibility of the puzzle. The failure lies in the attempted solution and the assumption of it being inside a box. The assumption is a paralyzes our thinking. And it cripples us from making and solving the puzzle. You see, it is our preconceived assumption that offers a paralysis that cripples and makes solving the puzzle impossible. Inside the system of a box, it does not matter in the least which combination of 4 straight lines one now tries, or in what sequence or order. One always finishes with at least one unconnected dot. And again, we have those illustrated there in your manual. Inside the box, the problem is not solvable. Those within a system inside it cannot see the system they are in from inside the system. We don't know we have made that assumption. We are blind to our own invisible assumption that traps us in a box of our own making. Whatever involves all of a collection must not be one of the collection, as Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell stated in Principia Mathematica. You have to step outside of the collection to look at the collection as a whole. Our eyes, for example, can see everything else except our eyes. We can use a mirror, but you can't. The eye can see the hands and the feet and our bodies, but it can't see itself. We can't see ourselves. It's harder to step outside of ourselves. Without stepping outside of our culture, our city, we cannot see our culture from the perspective of those outside our culture. Americans find it very difficult as an American to see ourselves the way the rest of the world that are not Americans see us. It is only by stepping outside of ourselves that we are able to see ourselves from the outside. Without stepping outside ourselves, outside our political, our religious, our economic, and our social cultural box, we remain trapped within that invisible box that makes impossible our finding the solution to the problems in our own lives. We simply can never connect all of the dots. In 1944, during World War II, nationally known theologian, back in the days when theologians were nationally known, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, in which, in light of World War II, he examined democracy versus Marxism against the alternative vision of the Nazis. Which worldview, which city lived up to its expectation? Niebuhr believed, as a proponent of democracy, that democracy had a more compelling justification of itself and required a more realistic vindication of itself than the naive defense of democracy at that time, which was based excessively or on an excessive optimistic estimation of human nature. I'm okay, you're okay, we're all good. Which the contemporary experience of World War II was refuting. Human nature wasn't good. If World War II proved the justifications, the world is good, that were then being used to justify democracy, World War II was proving those justifications false. And therefore, according to Niebuhr, there is a danger that if you do away with those cheap arguments, it will seem to refute the democratic idea itself. Niebuhr faced the problem, and the reason I'm mentioning him is he faced the problem of needing to talk about democracy from the outside. And at the same time, he was talking to a people, Americans, on the inside of democracy who could not understand what he was saying. There was a world at war between cultural and political boxes, and that war raised the question about the ultimate meaning of life, which called the meaning of the boxes into question. It wasn't just which political system might be better. It's what is the underlying assumption of the meaning of life and the value of humanity at work inside the different systems. Niebuhr, in his writing then, comments on a verse from 4th Ezra, the book of 4th Ezra, for Ezra. And what good is it that an everlasting hope has been promised to us, but we have miserably failed? The circumstances of a world at war forced us out of our cultural and political boxes and gave us the freedom to ask about the meaning of life. Nobody wants to talk about the ultimate meaning of life today in our culture, and yet the pandemic keeps pushing us to have to step outside of our current cultural American box. For those of us in the United States, I realize we have many people that are watching these that aren't part of this. I'm only using America as an example. We all have to step outside of our current situation to raise the larger question during a worldwide pandemic: what is the meaning of life and the value of life in the first place? He goes on to say, the individual may ask with 4th Ezra, how does it profit that here is foretold an imperishable hope, whereas we are brought so miserably to futility in achieving it? That is to say, we will recognize in our own life that our own life is not completely fulfilled with the way we have been living as a happy member of our city, the box we live in. And the promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if that's our box, if that is our hope, the distance between the hope and where we are causes us to question the ultimate value and reality. These profound questions about life from the perspective of an individual who is able to step back and out and see the whole role of history in his country and the broad panorama of history, sees that flux and fluctuation in time that we dealt with in our last session. A fluctuation in time, the lack of permanence of the values of one era that is succeeded by a different era that cancels out the values of the previous era. The changing eras imply a panorama of eternity, not just the perspective of the moment. And it is in that way, in stepping backwards, that a consciousness that transcends the moment, transcends time and the circumstances, the flux of time, lets us see how the particular box, the city that we're living in, came into existence, and how it may be passing away as someone else changes the dots. For example, we may have the dots connected like this, and this is an empty dot, and that is an empty dot, and so this is the culture we're born into, and of course we're just used to having missing dots left out. But somebody else comes along and says, wow, let's just connect these dots and forget about those. Who needs the corners? This is our world now. And so you're looking at a change in which box we're living in, but we haven't changed the reality. We're still trapped in a box. It is a moment in time that says, this is eternal, this is absolute, our values are the values of all time, versus a new era, a new generation that comes along, throws out the old, and now says, no, this is what's real. This are the absolute values by which we will now live, and these dots that we used to connect are no longer important. And not only are they no longer important, they were invalid in the first place. Everything you thought was true here is not true now. Welcome to the transience of life, and if we can step outside the box, we can begin to see a consciousness enter into being aware of eternity and living in a value system larger than our particular political, social, economic system. Wars are fought between boxes. A war is fought between democracy and communism. If we pick those two, we could pick the Nazis as another one. Whatever label you want to put on them, my dad can beat up your dad. My political party is better than your political party. Economic, political, religious, social, and ethnic wars are fought between boxes, none of which connect all the dots. None of which connect all the dots. Every human connection of the dots is momentary, it is partial, and never absolute. It is only by transcending our own box that ultimate answers to ultimate questions are found. It is only by stepping out of our own box that we see not only our box, but everyone else's box as well. Living outside of a box changes how we see the world, how we see others in the world, and changes how we now live our lives. And you've got a picture there of stepping outside the box. You see, if we do it this way, and we've got our dots, and we no longer assume a box, we can step outside of the box. I went a little too far outside. We step outside the box. We stay outside the box. We come to here and back up through here, and we have no box. And if I had started with this dot, I could come here, and we don't even have anything enclosed, and we have connected all. We are living differently here, outside of a box, in a different world of freedom and free will that we do not have inside a box that dictates which dots we have to live with being connected. The city is our box. And by city, I don't mean this city or that visible city. By city is meant our particular cultural identity, our cultural box, filled with unexamined presuppositions that govern our choices and prescribe the choices we make, dictate the options. The choice between Paris or Rome, London or New York, are choices between different boxes, but they're still boxes. Each box promises its own solution, a way to have fun and value and peace on earth, goodwill toward mankind, by its way of connecting the dots, the way they do it in Paris or the way they do it in Berlin. The pattern of life we give you in Los Angeles, when we connect our dots according to our way of connecting them, will give meaning and value, happiness and fulfillment to all who live within our glorious city. Just erase the name and plug it in and you get the meaning. In 1989, Paris built a new monument, La Grande Arche, euphemistically known as the Cube. It's a huge structure. It sits 2.5 miles from the Arc de Triomphe, itself a huge structure, created, as it were, to be bookends in the city of Paris. You have, with the Arc of Triumph, they bookend the symbol of military victory. And you have with La Grande Arche, the Cube, as a monument to humanity and to humanitarian ideals rather than and as opposed to military victory. It is, in fact, this cube, the ultimate identification of all man-made cities. It becomes the metaphor for every city of mankind in which man becomes his own Deus, his own God, and God is absent in the cities of man because he is invisibly absent because we do not see him in our lives. This new monument is a giant cube that is totally hollow in its center. There is no middle dot, as it were. There is no dot to remind us that something or someone is missing. The cube, the box, is hollow and empty, just like mankind without God. We have there in your manual, you have then the illustration, the photograph of La Grande Arche, the cube in Paris, a tremendous metaphor for the pride of mankind and the emptiness of mankind, and ultimate value and ultimate meaning without God. Well, let us speak of the box of Western culture. You're going, why? It's because we're leaving something. Abraham left something. We need to know that a leaving is required if we are to go to the New Jerusalem. Western culture itself is a gigantic city. It is a manner of living, of connecting the dots, 25 centuries in the making, 2,500 years in the making, and geographically now covering much of the globe. I'm going to stop here. We're going to take a brief break now, and we will come back with the box of Western culture when we return. We'll be right back. Thanks. Okay, welcome back. We're dealing with the box of Western culture, a culture and a box that's been 25 centuries in the making. Many times already over our journey through the apocalypse, we have encountered Plato and Aristotle. They are the foundational fathers of intellectual thinking of our Western box. The intellectual foundation of Western thinking, the Western understanding of knowledge, that is the epistemological box within which Western intellectual thought occurs and takes place, began at least with Plato and Aristotle, if not earlier with the pre-Socratics. The ancient Greeks lived inside their Grecian urn, their intellectual box. For them, there was no creation. What is has always been. There was no categorical change from nothing to something. There was only the change within what already is. There was, for example, the change from potentiality to actuality. I cover this in greater detail in our study, Paradise Has Two Trees, and I will not repeat myself now. You see, Aristotle ruled out the conceivability of change, the kind of change of stepping outside of what is. He would have ruled out this and said only this, and changes inside the box of which way you connect the dots is possibility. There is the change, for example, of potential to actual inside because the stuff already exists. He said there cannot be motion of motion or becoming of becoming, or in general, change of change. You can have change within a system, but you can't change systems. There's only one system, the box, for the world. For Aristotle, there is only this box, this reality, this matrix, this paradigm of understanding and experiencing the world. For Aristotle, reality and his intellectual perception of it were identical. How I think agrees with what's there. Rejecting Plato's dualistic epistemology, Aristotle asserted the singular epistemology of empirical rationalism, human reason with empirical dots. Plato had studied under Socrates. Aristotle studied under Plato, and created a contrary system of thought. He connected the dots differently than Plato. Aristotle also had a famous student, not a scholar, not a philosopher. His student was Alexander the Great, who created a world, an empire, a box based on Aristotle's rejection of the change of change, only change of becoming inside a box. Aristotle defined the nature of humanity as the society, the social need to create a city. The meaning of individual human life is to participate in creating a city. It takes a village. The Greek term for city is polis. The English terms political, politics, politician derive from polis. And the governmental structuring and governing, not only the structure, but the act of governing by which a polis controls itself and its citizens. The term city, citizen, and civilization derive from the Latin term civitas, or civatus, a settlement where the nomads settled, where those freed from food production, farming, settled, and created settlements, the civitas, the cities. Regarding human nature, Aristotle said that what something is revealed in what it becomes. The nature of a thing is its end. This is a nice observation. For what each thing is, when fully developed, we call that its nature. Whether we're speaking of a man, a horse, or a family. Thus, the destiny of an acorn is to become an oak tree and is understood by what it is destined to become. We have no argument against Aristotle on this. Aristotle believed the existence and creation of a state, a government, a country, was evidence of the natural development of mankind to become its end. The existence of cities and empires is evidence of the goal of humanity. From these things, therefore, it is clear that we translated city-state, but his word, Aristotle's word, is simply polis. The city is a natural growth, and that man is by nature a political animal, a politikon animal, a polis-making animal. Mankind is by nature the one who creates the polis, the city. Therefore, mankind is the cityfied species. For Aristotle, the city is the goal and the end for which humanity strives and achieves. And as the end, the goal, the purpose, thus also the polis is prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually. The polis is our goal and dictates who we are to become and defines us, the acorn, by the tree we are to be. For the whole must necessarily be prior to the part. It is the polis, the city, that domesticates individuals and cities them. For the Greeks, those not yet citified were deemed barbarians, inferior, and in need of being politicized, citified. According to Aristotle, only by achieving and living in the city, the polis, does one reach and achieve his true and actual identity and reason for living. Without the city, individuals are incomplete. Law and justice only exist in the city, according to Aristotle, and without the city, and thus separated from law and justice, without the city, we are devoid of virtue, and mankind is the most unholy and savage of animals, and the worst in regard to sexual indulgence and gluttony. Justice, on the other hand, I'm quoting Aristotle, is an element of the polis for judicial, legal procedure, which means the decision of what is just, righteous, is the regulation of the political partnership, the politikis koinonies, that political partnership, the communal citification that unites us in common agreement of our city. This is Aristotle's city. There is nothing outside the box. There is only the box, the city. There is no change to being outside the box. There is only change within the box. The only thing outside the box would be the barbarians that have not yet achieved their movement from being an acorn to being citified. There is only change within the box, the transformation from barbarian to being citified member of the whole, a functioning cog within the box, an organic member serving the good of the whole, the city. The change would be, which box do we want the Greeks making it a Greek box, or do we want the Persians making it a Persian box? Alexander the Great set out to change within his empirical world. He connected the dots according to the pattern of the Greek polis, the Greek city, the Greek box, the Greek rational way of ordering one's life, one city and one's culture, now became the way of Alexander's empire, which became the way of the Roman Empire, became the way of Augustine's Catholic Empire, became the way of the British Anglican Empire, and the way of the American Protestant Empire, each in turn ordering the lives and the people of their culture to behave and think a particular way. Following Aristotle's example, Alexander the Great Hellenized the world, cityfied them into being Greek citizens of the world. The Western world's box is a Greek city. Man is a cityfied animal, living, as it were, in a zoo. And the West is westernizing the world. You could argue that the conflicts of the world going on are conflicts against boxes, between boxes, conflicts of culture, and different ways of ordering existence according to differing cultures. We have a Western invisible presupposition. After the Fourth Crusades, rape of Constantinople in 1204, it brought the knowledge of Aristotle to the West. Augustine's city of God, already heavenly Platonic, making use of Plato, began to yield to Aristotelian epistemology brought in by Thomistic thinking of Thomas Aquinas. Slowly, the city of the West embraced a changeless, rationalistic reality, and its scholastic epistemology, with Platonic experiential knowledge no longer an option, reality became rational, and rational reality became containable in books, where there was no longer a need to experience nature directly, no need to experience life directly. The human brain could think it, write it. All we had to do was read it in a book, and we could know it. That's all it took. For example, during the 1200s, the 13th century, the University of Paris attempted to answer the question of whether oil left outside in cold weather would congeal. They sought to answer that question by searching the writings of Aristotle rather than by looking at what real oil would really do under those circumstances. Human knowledge under rationalism was reduced to only empirical knowledge, which could be recorded in books and learned by others reading books. An example of that happens to be me. I know those of you that have studied Latin and Greek and other languages spot immediately when I'm using one of those terms from those particular languages, and I mispronounce them because I have not learned them from speaking them in a linguistic setting. I've only learned them by reading that word and that term in a book. How grand education, eschewing obfuscation, reality, how absurd. 4 letters make a bird. In the same way that the presuppositions of a box kept us from solving the 9-dot problem, likewise the invisible presuppositions of our city keep us locked in a box without real answers to the real personal questions of our own lives. The invisible presuppositions create a paralysis that makes us existential cripples, unable to leave the box, unable to live and think outside the box. The city is the only world we have ever known. There's a nagging within us. It seems there's something missing in the cube. There's something that ought to be there, at least even if we don't connect it. Regardless of how many dots have been connected, there is at least one dot left out. We may be asking ourselves, what good is all this talk about Aristotle, Plato, Alexander the Great, boxes and dots and scholastic epistemology? For crying out loud, Deacon Ezra, get a life! Well, let me bring us closer to our world today in terms out of our present day lives. Frenchman Jacques Ellul, I think I referred to him maybe last week, a sociologist and theologian, fought with the French underground in World War II. In ways very similar to Reinhold Niebuhr, the war forced Ellul out of his cultural, scholastic, sociological box and forced him to ask the questions of the meaning of life from a different perspective. That is, from outside his Western box. He first published his book, The Presence of the Kingdom, in 1951. In it, Ellul invisibly wrestles, not unlike I did in my little poem I quoted, though unlike me, Ellul was in full awareness with whom he wrestled. He describes the 20th century and now the 21st century. He describes humanity's struggle with visible reality phenomenon and the written account, what he calls the explanatory myth created by the box. That is, how does a contemporary person know what to do with firsthand experience of reality, even invisible reality, when all we have ever known and have ever been trained to know is the second-hand account, the written account of what is real? He describes the experience of being caught between experience and a written account, like being caught between two shadows. If you've only read Shakespeare's sonnets and the poetry of, I went blank on her name, the love songs, if that's your knowledge of falling in love, what do you do when you eventually do experience falling in love and you try to make a choice between the two? Or do we go through our life imposing poetry as our understanding of love and finding the person inside the poem to be our one and only? caught between two shadows. And at that moment, he cannot tell and does not yet know which one, if either, is now real. We may just recognize ourselves in what he says. I'm about to quote. At least we will recognize our present day world in what he says, written 70 years ago. The man of the 20th century oscillates unceasingly between the phenomenon and the explanation, the explanatory myth. That is to say, between two shadows, both of which are extremes and are opposed to each other. First, Elul now is going to explain the factual side in which we find ourselves. The phenomenon might be described as the external presentation of a fact. Our contemporaries only see the presentations that are given them by the press, the television, propaganda, and publicity found on social media and the internet. The man of the present does not believe in his own experiences, in his own judgment, in his own thought. He leaves all of that to what he sees in print, hears on the radio, or sees on social media and the internet. In his eyes, in our eyes, a fact becomes true only when we have read an account of it or seen it on social media. And we measure the importance of that piece of information by the size of the headlines and by the number of likes it gets. What us, does not count if it has not been officially interpreted on the internet, if there is not already a crowd of people who shares his own prior experience. We discount our own thinking in behalf of the mass thinking given to us. This statement, this is still Elul speaking, which may seem oversimplified, is in reality at the basis of all propaganda. An untrue fact is given on social media or the internet and seen by 1,000,000. 1,000 people know that the fact is false, but 999,000 believe it is true. Thus, the fact becomes true. That is what I mean by phenomenon or shadows that the modern person grasps and knows exclusively. Why exclusively? Because every day we have a number, a very limited number perhaps, of genuine experiences, but we are so embedded in our habit of only trusting experiences of others that have been quantified on the internet that we don't even know we just had our own experience. On the other hand, we learn 1,000 things every day from television, social media, and the internet very important and sensational things. Can we help it that our little personal experience, which deal perhaps with the excellence of a plum we had at lunch, or even the condition of the razor blade we checked to before we shaved this morning. Those little experiences are totally overlooked and ignored. They're drowned out in the flood of important internet illusions concerning whatever the headlines of the day are. In the 50s, the atomic bomb, the fate of Germany. We could add the headlines of whatever's going on in our world today. And now these are facts which we will never experience directly like we did the plum we sampled. It is these shadows which now become our life and our thought. Shadows from the internet. The result is that the modern person, submerged by this flood of images, which we cannot verify personally, we are utterly unable to master the flood of information. News succeeds news without ceasing. We read about something today, tomorrow it is replaced by others, and it is forgotten. We get used to living like this, without a present and without a past. We get used to living in this complete incoherence because all our intellectual activity is taken up with fugitive visions of information, themselves without a past, without a future, and without any substance even in the present. But in our actual reality, real facts, within the reach of every one of us to appreciate the full moon this morning, that super moon, that would have been moonset at sunrise, to appreciate the sunset, to appreciate that flower. That reality has become hidden, invisible now, because we become unaware that it was even there. These experiences, the moon this morning, they have no outward reality because they have not been on 1,000,000 times on the internet describing the sweetness of that plum. So, of course, the daily facts of our own lives, the real facts of our living, do not exist, we think. That is, they do not exist until someone invents Facebook, and in order to prove that we exist, at least to ourselves, we post the facts of our lives on the internet. I think, therefore I am, has given way to I'm on Facebook, therefore I am. We verify our own existence by virtually existing on the internet. I'm still quoting Philo. I just updated his illustrations of a newspaper to our contemporary illustrations of social media. He says it is obvious mankind evidently needs a certain coherence. We cannot submit to it being simply, we're only an eye that's just registering. I see it, I see it, I see it. Without understanding that the jerky images of a mad kaleidoscope, jerking up and down, what do they mean? Mankind needs some logical connection. We demand that there should be some coherence, some connection between all the surface information and facts. Therefore, the more the press and the propaganda develop along their own lines, the more they appeal to the crowd, the more it becomes necessary to simplify and to present news, information, and ideas in a very condensed bumper sticker soundbite. The need for an explanation and the link between all this information still remains, and this explanation and this link, however, must be on the level of the average reader, a level which automatically sinks lower and lower. I must say at this point, I've finished with the lull. I'm going to finish with us in just a second. I want to thank you for participating and being with us. We said at the very beginning of this journey that this was not a Sunday school class, and we have not lowered the thinking level to include first graders. We have spoken on an adult level to adults, and we may find it very difficult to make sense of what we're saying. Hopefully, you've gotten the manual, or when the book comes out, you'll buy the book and be able to have it at your own pace and digest it. But you see, in order to validate our own lives, let us not let someone else do our own thinking for us. This is today what Elul has described is the experience of living with a hodgepodge and daily bombardment of dots which we cannot connect. There are too many, and they appear too quickly and disappear just as quickly. The 9-dot problem is a two-dimensional, on a page, metaphor for our three-dimensional lives. Our world, our city in which we live, is an enormous, invisible box, a gigantic, invisible cube. It is the matrix, the gestalt, the paradigm within which we live our lives, the unexamined presuppositions that we take for granted. There are hundreds upon hundreds, even thousands upon thousands of dots bombarding us, pieces of information demanding attention, demanding to be processed not only into our thinking, but processed into our lives. we face a sensory overload, desperate for coherence in our lives, desperate for something that makes sense out of that which no longer makes sense. We need someone to connect the dots together for us. Elul calls this connection of the dots an explanatory myth. The explanatory myth connects the dots and gives coherence, and if not meaning, a way of understanding our own lives. This leads us, he says, to the other pole of our extraordinary present intellectual situation, the explanatory myth, which is the real support of our whole intellectual system. All explanations, all explanatory myths are man-made copies of the original spiritual explanation, and as man-made copies, they also have, all man-made myths have a spiritual root and are only accepted by an absolute blind credulity and become the intellectual key which serves to open all secrets, serves to interpret all facts, and to understand what is happening in the tempest of being bombarded by this myriad of incoherent dots. What's going on? I don't know the world. I went to bed one night and woke up, and like Rip Van Winkle, I no longer know the world I'm in. In the 20th century, many explanatory myths were explicitly ideological, political, economic, and racial. Such explanatory myths back in the 50s included the bourgeois myth of the hand of Moscow, the socialist myth of the 200 families ruling the country, the fascist myth of the Jews ruling society, the communist myth of the anti-revolutionary saboteur, and the myth of making the world safe for democracy. Trapped in the box, the matrix, the cube of one's city, mankind's predicament becomes evidently very serious. Modern man has no other means of intellectual coherence or of political investigation than the myth. If he abandons the explanation given to him by his box, he cuts himself off from the world in which he is living. You see, we are unaware we are in a box. We're unaware we are in Aristotle's box, from which there is no escape and therefore no alternative. We live our lives empty and without experiential meaning, trapped inside Aristotle's empirical box. Thus, our 21st century myth, our box, our city, is not only the means of understanding and the coherence, it is also the only element which seems fixed amid all the streams of facts. It is this somehow absolute empiricism that helps us to avoid thinking for ourselves, avoid the fatigue of thinking for ourselves. The city now thinks for us. It does our thinking for us. Modern man has a good conscience because he has an answer for everything, an explanation for whatever happens to him and whatever he does. All depends on the explanation which is provided for him by the empirical myth. But this process lands him in the most complete unreality. We live in a perpetual dream. It's a realist dream, a utopian dream, woven out of innumerable facts and theories in which modern man, modern woman believes with all her might, as one now involved in mass civilization. It is impossible to break away from the masses without dying, to be isolated. You see, the end has brought us back to our beginning. Aristotle was at least correct when he said we are what we become. His error was in saying we become a city, a polis, and when we look at a world without God, that's what we become. He is correct. He is incorrect, however, that we were not created to be a world without God. Our Creator created this universe out of nothing. And when He did, He created us in His image with free will, not a box that locks us in, free will, to use our free will and become like God, our Creator. We are judged by our futures, not by our past. We are judged by becoming like our Creator. Yes, that is our end. It is our beginning to achieve that end. Aristotle is correct in saying godless mankind makes a city its goal. We are trapped in Aristotle's empirical box. So therefore, what good is it to talk about Plato and Aristotle? What about Alexander the Great and all the Western empires if we are doomed to endless rearranging the myth to how we make the dots connect, if we're doomed to being Sisyphus, rolling the boulder up the mountain every day of our lives, only to see it roll to the bottom? What's the point? Inside Aristotle's box, there is no point. There is no change. There is no room for free will. We are trapped in a godless Aristotelian empirical box after all. And so, after all our words today, we've come full circle and returned to the fourth Ezra. And what good is it that an everlasting hope has been promised to us when we have so miserably failed and cannot reach that home, cannot reach that hope. Oh, my dear friends, Abraham left. When our children were small, a man gave us several flop-eared rabbits and their hutches, which we kept in our backyard. One morning, going out to feed them, I saw the door to one of the hutches was standing wide open. Somehow, one of us had failed to latch the door securely the day before. Hurriedly, I ran to the hutch, fully expecting to shut the proverbial barn door, and there, to my surprise, instead of an empty hutch, I found that flop-eared rabbit still safely inside. I quickly shut and latched its door. I have thought of that moment and that rabbit many times since. I do not know why it did not leave, why it did not escape from its hatch. This rabbit had lived its entire life in a hutch. Living inside a hutch was the only world it knew. He did not know there was any world outside his world, outside his hutch. If there was nowhere to go, why leave? Abraham was no rabbit. He may not have had a place to go. He may not have known where he was going, but he had a place to leave. He could leave the box of the city without God. He left. Abraham left Ur. He left the box. He left the city. That's our starting place. We too have a place to leave. We have a box to get out of, a place to leave. There is a place outside the box. Haran is outside the box. Abraham left. He departed. Let us, in our desire to find the New Jerusalem, let us, with Abraham, leave Ur. Well, God bless you for being part of this journey with us. Next week, we will be on the journey with Abraham, as we now are no longer leaving, but are going toward. By God's grace, we'll see everyone again next week, and we'll continue our journey with Abraham together. Thank you, and God bless you for being with us. Amen.